And great to join everyone. It's we've Ajahn Kovilo and I have appreciated these sessions with the Sati Center and just the flavor of the teachings that Sati Center kind of invites and cultivates in terms of really diving deep into the texts and merging this intellectual edge with also just the heart. And yeah, cosmology is one of my favorite subjects, and the hells are just interesting and not spoken about a lot, so why not dive right in? I gave a retreat maybe about a year ago, titled All the Unpopular Buddhist Topics, and I really like talking about the unpopular Buddhist topics, Asubha, cosmology, the hells and heavens, because there's a huge amount of wisdom in these realms that I think have gone kind of unacknowledged or unmetabolized by Western Buddhism. And Ajahn Kovilo last week spoke about the heavens and also about the various ways we can interpret this or interact or relate to this cosmology. Longpo Sucitto says that we have cosmology in the Buddha, or sorry, we have psychology, the Buddha had cosmology. And second, I'm going to share a screen. I won't follow this handout exactly, but parts of it will be useful. And it'll also make my face a bit smaller so I don't have to look at myself the whole time I'm talking, which is good. All right. Great. So in Buddhism, the way the Buddha talked about how reality manifests and the sort of law that determines the conditioned realms arising is called idapachayata, or I'm going to cover up my image a bit. That conditionality. And this is basically when this is, that is, when this isn't, that isn't, when this arises, that arises, when this ceases, that ceases, which is an acknowledgement that conditions and the reality we see manifest based on past conditions and present ones coming up. So there's a temporal causality. When this arises, that arises. And there's also concurrent conditionality. When this is, that is. When you stick your hand in fire, it burns. That's immediate. Whereas additionally, when you do something, set a cause in motion right now, it manifests in the future. That's temporal. And what that law means is that we end up with a chaotic system. And one feature of chaos theory is something called scale invariance, where a pattern repeating on a small micro level will repeat at every scale. So you can see this in a fractal or a Mandelbrot set. And basically what it implies is that whatever patterns we see operating in our mind or in the cosmos, there will be echoes of that or mirrors of that on every scale. And the beauty of that is that the image that the Buddha gives of cosmology, this vast array of beings and realms, heavens, hells, ghosts, realms, etc., it's a macrocosm of the same patterns that manifest in our mind day to day right here. And what that means is that you take this seed of the mind and you expand it out, and what you get is the cosmos, the cosmology. And by being willing to interact with that cosmology, to look at the stories that have grown up around it about how the Buddha spoke about these realms and how the tradition spoke about them, you can gain some really useful insights and depictions of our own mental states. And the scale invariance is a really powerful principle. It implies that, one thing that happens often is when people meditate, they'll find, say, you can't stop controlling the breath or berating yourself when you stray from a meditation object. And one of the most powerful insights people have is realizing that whatever pattern they're manifesting in that moment is actually the pattern dominating their whole life. How they're trying to control their breath is how they're trying to control their child. How they're berating themselves for not being able to stay with the meditation is how they're criticizing themselves for not being a good enough husband or wife or child or parent. And as you sit with those patterns on the cushion, softening them, getting to know them, you soften them on the much wider scale of a life. And what's done on the cushion has enormous implications, as most of the people on this call probably know, for how your life manifests. So scale and variance. And it's useful to see that cosmology can just be looked at that way. Each of these stories can be taken as parables or similes. And to note that many of the stories referenced here or spoken of in the handout I sent out, which draws a lot from Longpo Punadhammo, Ajahn Punadhammo's book, The Buddhist Cosmos, or Buddhist Cosmology. No, The Buddhist Cosmos. And that's free online. Just Google The Buddhist Cosmos, Punadhammo. And it was written maybe 7 years ago. And it's brilliant. We owe Ajahn Punadhammo so much for actually being the first to really compile in a way for the Western eye and ear the whole corpus of Buddhist cosmology. And I would, on his YouTube channel, there's also an amazing series going through each of those realms. And the one thing I'd say is that when you go into these stories, one has to realize that though the Buddha did speak about these realms, often what he said was fairly, it was not too detailed. And a huge amount of the literature around these realms are later additions, Jataka tales that have been incorporated through centuries after the Buddha into the corpus, or the Petavatu, which was written and composed centuries after the Buddha, the commentaries. And a lot of the stories are a bit crazy or a bit out there. Crazy is not the right word. That's not respectful, but somewhat hard to believe in a literal sense. And just to know that if one comes across a story that seems very, very difficult to believe or very doubtful, immediately believing that the Buddha said it and that one's doubt has to apply to the Buddha's teachings is not the correct inference. Most of the time, the stories that really seem quite out there will be later additions. And there's often a lot of wisdom hidden in those teachings. And so it's worth kind of going into and just holding it lightly, having fun with it, and at the very least looking at them as these fascinating similes of the mind with the wisdom of centuries of tradition behind them. However, the Buddha did teach these things. And, one secular Dhamma's an important fixture of American Dharma and the Buddhism as it's been come to the US and the West in general. And it's a beautiful feature of Buddhism that that you don't have to, it doesn't rest on an article of faith, like so many of the great faiths. And Ajahn Jayasara will often draw a distinction between the Abrahamic religions, which often really do, they're referred to as the great faiths. They often do rest on these articles of faith. Either you accept a text or a certain being as a savior, or you don't. Whereas Buddhism, there is a cosmology spoken about, but the prime determination of whether you're practicing is how you're using these teachings to cultivate wholesome mind states and let go of unwholesome mind states, the four right efforts. And there's an amazing sutta called the Chanki Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 95, where a sort of belligerent Brahmin is confronting the Buddha. And the Buddha says, look, his name's Bharadvaja. Look, Bharadvaja, there are these different things that can turn out to be true or false. One believes something because one has heard it. And this can turn out to be true, and one acknowledges, one protects truth by saying, I believe this because my teachers have told me. But one does not yet come to the conclusion, only this is true and everything else is false. Or one believes in something because of logical reasoning, but one does not yet say or come to the conclusion, only this is true and everything else is false. One has faith in something and one says, I believe this because I have faith in it, but one does not yet come to the conclusion, only this is true and everything else is false, etc. And this is how one protects truth. It's a Buddhist epistemological humility, where we all acknowledge the limits of our knowledge, of our experience. And if we have faith in something, we can acknowledge that, but we don't yet come to this firm conclusion. And that applies for someone who believes in rebirth, and it applies for someone who doesn't. Both of us, every view can have this level of humility. And in the end, the final arrival at truth, the Buddha says, is when one contacts the deathless. So the place where the Buddha says you really can actually put down your post, your pillar of truth, is at that final liberation of mind. And in the end, that's experienced for oneself, and you don't really need to push that on others. It is what it is, and one touches the deathless for themselves. And that's such a powerful teaching and such a humble one. One thing I'd say about all this, however, is also that, and so the Buddha taught about these two levels of right view. And the first is the Four Noble Truths. This is super mundane right view, and every one of us can look at experience in terms of of seeing suffering, letting go of its cause, craving, realizing its cessation, nibbana, the third noble truth, and developing the path to that cessation, the Noble Eightfold Path. But the Buddha also speaks about super mundane right view, mundane right view. And effectively, that's these 10 aspects that all circle around the efficacy of karma. There is what is given, what is offered. There is mother and father, this debt we owe our parents. And there is this realm and the other realm. There are spontaneously reborn beings. So parts of that right view, mundane right view, do have to do with these realms of the cosmos. And of the three knowledges that the Buddha had on the night of his awakening, the Tevijja, there was the visions of his past lives, the visions of how other beings fall away and re-arise based on their karma. And then there was the vision of the ending of the defilements. But two of the three of those knowledges were about rebirth and the disenchantment that brought on. So it is a significant part of his teaching. It's not completely peripheral at all. And for me, that's actually where, I think one can really say, yeah, I don't believe in these teachings completely. But I think where one goes too far is by saying the Buddha didn't hold these views. The Buddha didn't actually teach this. These are later interpolations, or he was just speaking to the culture as it stood at that moment. If you read through the canon, it's really impossible to come away with the view that the Buddha did not actually teach these things. And the Buddha dismissed as impossible a teaching that would both be beneficial and untrue. Everything the Buddha said, he spoke about with honesty. So at least letting the Buddha have his teaching. Whether we believe in that or not is kind of up to us. A good useful simile I know that Ajahn Nisabho has used is just to say that as we practice, we really do begin to have confidence in these teachings. And Ajahn Nisabho often compares it to a map where, we look at a map and over the years we see the map says there's a tree and there's a tree, and the map says there's a river and there's a river. And on the map, we see in the distance, these huge mountains, and we've never seen mountains before. But after years of seeing the accuracy of this map, do we just say, okay, no, that must be completely made up, Or do we say, I've never seen mountains, but this map has been so accurate, maybe they do exist. And, I would just say that I think the agnostic view of these realms, it has a place at the beginning, and I think people can really, you don't have to accept these things literally. But I would also say that I would encourage people, if you practice for a long time, that the Buddha really did take these things seriously, and it might be worth investigating a little bit more, just giving the Buddha that much credit. And there's a book called Life Before Life by Jim B. Tucker, based on the research at the University of Virginia on basically thousands of cases of finding children recollecting past lives and recording those recollections and then verifying them against things that it seems very difficult for those children to have known any other way than if they had indeed been in this previous rebirth. And so I think it behooves us as Buddhists who've gained so much from these teachings, if you're going to read a book, maybe read that one, like giving the Buddha enough credit to actually push ourselves a little bit, because my experience is that it does make a difference actually to hold these teachings in that way. It's not necessary, but I think it's worth pushing a little bit on that. And if I can't do that as a monk, then who can? So enough said about that. And thank you for people's patience around all that. But at the very least, this is a really fascinating realm. So let's dive in a little bit more. The 5 realms that the Buddha spoke about, they're called the jati. And there's a fascinating sutta called it's Majjhima Nikaya 12. I think it's the Mahadukkha Kanda Sutta. And I love these images. The Buddha basically lays out the realms of the cosmos, or of, effectively the mind as well. And he compares, by encompassing mind with mind, I understand a certain person thus. This person so behaves, so conducts himself, has taken such a path that on dissolution of the body after death, he will reappear in a state of deprivation, in an unhappy destination, and perdition in hell. And then later on, with the divine eye, which is purified and surpasses the human, I see that on the dissolution of the body after death, he has reappeared in a state of deprivation, in an unhappy destination, and perdition in hell, and is experiencing exclusive, painful, racking, piercing feelings. Suppose there was a charcoal pit deeper than a man's height, full of glowing coals, without flame or smoke, and then a man scorched and exhausted by hot weather, weary, parched, and thirsty, came by a path going in one way only, and directed to that same charcoal pit. Then a man with good sight, on seeing him, would say, this person so behaves, so conducts himself, has taken such a path, that he will come to this same charcoal pit. And then later on he sees that he has fallen into that charcoal pit, and is experiencing exclusively painful, racking, piercing feelings. So too, encompassing mind with mind, etc., he sees that this person has fallen on that state. So we have the hell realms compared to a charcoal pit. The Buddha then compares the next lower realm, the animal realm, to a cesspit. And then he compares the ghost realm, the peta realm, to a person parched with thirst coming to a tree growing on uneven ground with scanty foliage casting a dappled shadow. So sort of a barren tree where one tries to find shade. He then compares the human realm to the shade of a lush tree. He then compares the Deva realm of the heavenly beings, which Ajahn Kovilo spoke to last week, to a heavenly mansion. And finally, he compares awakening, nibbana, to a pond with clean, agreeable, and cool water, transparent with smooth banks, delightful and nearby a dense wood. And then a person, scorched and exhausted by hot weather, weary, parched, and thirsty, came by a path going in one way and experienced exclusively pleasant feelings. So there's something there. One is, in the West, we often think of the animal realm as kind of, a beautiful place people can really romanticize it. But the Buddha spoke about the animal realm as one of fear and hunger. And you really look carefully at what the experience of an animal is like, of the insects, of the prey animals who have no choice but to constantly be in fear. I mean, if you walk up to a deer, you'll see the state of constant anxiety that they're in. Or to a predator who has no choice but to kill for their food. And it's really compared to a very low rebirth and very hard to emerge from. The ghost realm, and this is the pettas. And what's so interesting is the pettas in Buddhist cosmology are almost echoes of the human, and the state is characterized by obsession. And what's interesting there is that realm is it's a poor echo of the human realm, where the human realm is compared to this tree lush with foliage. The ghost realm is a tree of scanty foliage. And this idea that the ghost realm is actually quite near to ours, but a sort of colorless version. The human realm, despite all of its difficulties, despite its drawbacks, is a really good rebirth. Not only is it so useful for practice, but it's compared to this lush tree. So really understanding that if you've been reborn as a human, it's huge merit already. To the heavenly realms as a divine mansion, furnished with all these pleasures. And finally, to awakening, nibbana, as a cool pond. And what's so meaningful there is, of all the realms, the only place where that person parched with thirst, dying of thirst, finds water is nibbana. None of the other realms, no matter how nice they are, they're just a brief reprieve. The mansion of the heavenly realms is cool. There's no water there. The human realm, there's shade, but there's no water. It's, for those of you who haven't seen Jetsuma Tenzin Palmo's interview with us, she is the subject of the biography Cave in the Snow, one of the most senior Tibetan bhikkhunis who came from England and ordained and spent 10 years meditating in a cave. And she talks about this dream she had of seeing herself wake up in a prison. And it was this huge prison where there was people in the basement being tortured, and then there was these upper sort of penthouses where people were partying. But it was all a prison. And she talks about convincing a few people to escape with her, and she's running along the side of the prison, and it just stretches on and on and on. And she looks in through the windows, and she sees some people through the windows being these little vignettes, people being tortured and people partying in the upper chambers. But they're all in the prison. And the prison just keeps stretching on, and she keeps on running. And eventually she almost gives up. She thinks, gosh, I'll never reach the end of this. But then she thinks, if I stop running, the people who are behind me, who are depending on me, they'll fall back in prison too. If I give up, they'll give up. And as soon as she thinks that, the prison ends, and she finds herself, it's a fascinating depiction, she finds herself in this sort of suburbia of clean-cut lawns, these beautiful houses, and she walks up to one of the houses, and there's a woman who comes out and asks her where she's coming from. And Jetsuma says, I'm coming from that prison. I just ran from it. And the woman says, oh yeah, not many people make it out of there. Um, and it's such a powerful vision. And for me, the heart of it in this case is the idea that however good the prison gets, it's still a prison. And to not be distracted by that. And to know that as one practices, you begin to see that you're moving outside of that usual metric, even just in this lifetime. Your mind can go through these deep states of hell and heaven. Things can get really good. You can come across these profound states of happiness. Life, a job can be going very well. You can be in a relationship that feels heavenly. But to notice that as that's happening, if you're practicing, something else is being cultivated that's beyond all that. It's like we usually measure our life on an XY axis, and our happiness and suffering are up and down based on this XY axis. But as you practice, it's almost like you open up a Z axis, and even though the up and downs of a relationship and a job can continue on the XY axis as they would, some other quality is being cultivated in the heart that's completely separate from that. The relationship can break up, the child can be going through difficulties, the job can be lost, but the heart has suddenly touched some other grounding that's beyond all of that. And for me, that's the sense that though the practice does lead to these brighter realms, the Deva realms and more, even as it's leading us that way, the fact that we're also cultivating wisdom means that we're stepping out of that whole paradigm. We can watch our minds go through all these realms, but if we're practicing well, we're also cultivating, stepping more and more towards that cool water and the bank. And the thing about an oasis is it's not flashy. It's not the mansion of the devas. It's just a cool pond. But there's something so grounding in the fact that that's where we're stepping towards as we practice. So, this is just a brief kind of depiction of the different realms of right view, of kind of trying to frame mundane and transcendent right view, and of really allowing for people to interact with these teachings in different ways. And in the next kind of talk, we'll actually dive into those lower realms in more detail. But I think just for now, maybe wrapping up, and we'll have a chance to, I believe now in the schedule, do a little bit of a Q&A, and then we can take a break afterwards. And then dive deeper into the darker realms, which will be fun. So let's open things up a bit. We have about 20 minutes or so. What would people like to talk about? And just raise your cartoon hand if you have any questions or things you'd like to ask about just at this point. And if nothing ends up coming up, we can always take a break earlier and then do a longer talk and Q&A later when there's a little more meat to talk about. But looks like we have some questions. Matt, please.
Thank you, Ajahn. Could you talk a little bit more about if I can say this word correctly, pericope, for the mundane right view that you were discussing earlier? That I know that comes up very often in the suttas, but it's one of those things that I've never really understood or had it unpacked in such a way that kind of helped me out. If you could do that.
Yeah, great question. Who here kind of had at least some passing encounter with this tenfold aspect of mundane right view. There's what is given, what is offered. So it comes up a few times in the suttas, and once again, it's paired with supramundane right view, which is very beautiful. That at the end of the day, the right view that the Buddha most emphasizes is just this view that of the Four Noble Truths, of seeing dukkha in our experience, knowing how to let go of its cause, craving, and realizing peace. And that's such a simple, beautiful distillation of what really matters in the practice. I love that. But he also speaks about mundane right view, which is actually much, and supramundane right view is almost transcends all sense of duty and mundane, kind of the mundane considerations of life. Whereas mundane right view is all about how we honor this conditioned realm. And for me, it's a bit like depth perception, like one eye sees the transcendent and the other sees the immanent. And if we have both of those visions in mind, then we really can actually have depth perception for our lives. It's sort of this paradox. So mundane right view, I have this in the handout, Majjhima Nikaya 117. And how is right view the forerunner? One discerns, so this is wrong view. So just invert this for right view. There is nothing given, nothing offered, nothing sacrificed. There is no fruit or result of good or bad actions. There is no world, no next world. No mother, no father, no spontaneously reborn beings, no Brahmins or contemplatives who, faring rightly and practicing rightly, proclaim this world and the next after having directly known and realized it for themselves. So what I take from that is, the right view version of that is there is what is given, what is offered, what is sacrificed. There is the fruit and result of good and bad actions. So that's just speaking to the efficacy of karma. And the Buddha was very careful about debating other teachers. For example, he never criticizes a teacher by name to lay people, which is a beautiful bit of restraint and very meaningful to see that the Buddha had that care in how he spoke about other teachers. But if he was very critical of teachings that denied the fruit of action, because if one does that, then one basically is denying the ability of us to change our own hearts by putting in causes now, and one opens up a real dangerous realm where one's negative actions don't bear fruit, and one can engage in very unwholesome behavior and create the enormous causes of suffering without realizing it. So for me, those first aspects of right view are all about there is what is given, and there is the fruit of good action. So basically acknowledging the act of giving has a karmic potential. Similarly, there's this world and the next world, which I take to mean there is rebirth. And basically to say that those actions of karma taken on now manifest even into future lives. And that being significant because often, if this life is kind of all there is, we can live very virtuous lives, obviously. But if you think that an action might really echo out in very powerful ways over many, many lifetimes and influence a rebirth, it does bring a gravity to karma that I find is unique. And so I think that's why the Buddha emphasized that. There is mother and father, and for me, that really just means that of all those karmic duties, one that's extremely significant is our debt to our parents and filial piety, which I find to be such a beautiful bit that the Buddha put in there of like a big checkbox for us to mark off in this life is have we done well by our parents? Have we repaid a debt of gratitude that we owe them? So it's pretty meaningful that the Buddha actually put that, he had 10 points in this rundown of right view, and he raised that up as something to pay deep attention to that really influences the karmic flavor of our life. Have we done well by our parents? And finally, there are no, so there are spontaneously reborn beings. And for me, that indicates similarly this belief in these other realms of the ability for us to drop to the hells or go to the heavens. And there are Brahmins and contemplatives who basically have achieved enlightenment. So there is a way out of this whole thing, basically. So that's how I take all those aspects. And yeah, for me, there's a teacher that says Dhamma is duty. And you see with sort of crazy wisdom teachings and certain teachers who sort of disavow all convention and virtue because they say they're beyond that. For me, this is the rejoinder to that. Like, as we become more and more wise and see beyond convention, ironically and paradoxically, we become more and more attuned to honoring conditions of the conditioned realm and convention, skillful convention. But like even as Ajahn Chah, for example, saw past all these minutiae of the Vinaya, he would hold it impeccably. And it's just fascinating how that happens. Like even as we see the limits of the conventional world with transcendent right view, we learn more and more how to honor and work within those conventions through mundane right view. So how does that land all on that?
That was, thank you very much. That kind of cleared it up. So,
Yeah, yeah. I love those tenfold aspects. Yeah. Jess, I know you just put down your hand, but you're welcome to say something if this.
Sure, thank you so much. I've been interested. I practice a lot of the Theravada tradition, and every now and again, the cosmology will come up. But I feel like it's often brought up as if it's, oh, we're not supposed to talk about this within this realm. And I'm just curious if you could maybe speak a little bit to, perhaps why that may be. And I think even when I first started practicing, I had asked a similar question about different areas within Buddhism, and the guidance was, focus on one and first, and then once you really have practiced in one, you can explore others. And yeah, I would just be interested to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. And actually, if people wouldn't mind, maybe I could just, with no expectation of people believing in rebirth or not, I am just curious, how many people have a 70% and up belief in rebirth, just to get a brief view? That's, I mean, that's kind of astounding. I really did not expect that coming back to the US, is that kind of how many people actually are open to it. Um, so I think one of the reasons that, that's a great question, Jess. I think one of the reasons that it's not spoken about is just that up until recently, I feel like Buddhism was very much framed as it was a bit of a rejoinder, or not rejoinder, but it was, people really steered away from the religious parts of it, or the faith-based parts of it, because so many people were looking for something apart from the Christianity they'd grown up with. And Buddhism's initial framing when it came to the West as a philosophy and just a science of the mind was a very palatable kind of approach for a lot of, uh, you know, basically people who'd come from backgrounds with problematic faith beliefs. I feel like recently there's really been an inflection point that I see in American Buddhism. Just the number of you that raised your hands for openness to rebirth, I think 10 years ago that might have been very different. And I feel like there's a real, I think some people have become quite open to the importance of these teachings and are kind of ready for them. But I think that it's taking a while for that fact to be metabolized into the Buddhist zeitgeist, so to speak, and like for people to really see, like we were very cautious about giving talks on Asuba or cosmology initially. Seattle's the most secular city in the U.S., but the response has been unbelievably positive each time. So I think people are being more and more open. I think that also people are aware that some people really are turned off by these teachings. And granted, you're a pretty self-selecting group if you've come to hear me talk about the hell realms, but uh, because it's not the kind of pivot point of practice, which is just meditation and cultivating the wholesome, people have been cautious to bring them up. Um, and I think it's a deficit. I think it's a huge deficit in what we've left behind from, coming to the West. And I think it needs to be filled out. What I've seen is a few things. One is a lot of there's a strata of the mind that's a Jungian strata, and it speaks in the language of story, image, embodiment, and ritual. And those people I've talked to who really interact with the Dhamma purely intellectually, without any, even if you don't believe in those stories, with no kind of place for ritual or story, often or sometimes it's a bit like, it's a sense of very thin ice over roiling waters, and it seems brittle and can crack. Whereas if you use these old technologies of the heart, like story, myth, it kind of can settle and crystallize those deeper waters and allow the water to still and things to really settle at a very deep level. So that's one usefulness I see in these stories. The second is they're just fun, and like we, as people intuit the beauty of the Dhamma, like to make it into a whole life, you need stories and you need community and you need myth. And I just feel like filling out a full Buddhist life, there's a real place for these, a splash of color. It's fun. The third is there's really deep psychological truths hidden in these realms. So I think that's useful. And the fourth is genuinely, there's, I think people can think, oh, it doesn't really matter if I believe in these things at all. But there does come a point where I find it is relevant, actually. Like, for me, there was a whole year where I really thought about, like, gosh, how, I would wake up, I was sleeping in the jungle at that time under a little umbrella tent, which we sleep in Thailand. And I'd wake up many mornings covered in ants, because they can get under, and just think like, gosh, how rare to be reborn as a human. Like, it's so much more likely to be reborn as an insect or an ant or an animal. How rare. And I don't want to waste this moment. Like, it's such a precious rebirth. And that's a powerful recollection for us. If we think of straying from the path, or, of breaking sila in a powerful way, to be like, I don't know where my next life is going to land. Like, I cannot risk this. So that's a powerful recollection, but also I find it's not sustainable to live in that place of fear for very long. Like, for a year, I'm glad that kind of vision was burned into my mind so that it keeps me on guard. But and it's been interesting. Like, it's come out of there's been a few moments where I feel like that recollection has been given to me from the devas, actually. Like, there was, have been moments where I say, kind of broke a determination. Say I determined to not do something, and then I did it. Not big things, but just little things. And then I remember there was one time where I'd slipped, and 5 minutes later, someone texted me and said that they're like, I just listened to this talk by this one teacher who said that if one, what was it? If one is generous but doesn't keep good morality, one will be reborn as a pet in an American household. And it was like 5 minutes after I'd slipped on, something minor, but it really it was a good recollection. And I found the timing too conspicuous to be totally coincidental. But what I really find has been sustaining is thinking of these realms of, like, we've got really powerful beings rooting for us with the Dhamma. Like, there's an A team that surrounds dharmic scenes. And a huge portion of my life is predicated on belief in angels. Like, I came to Seattle and we decided just to show up and went to Pike Place for our one meal of the day. No one had signed up to give food. Very few people know what I am. And I'm just standing in Pike Place with a bowl that looks like a drum, so people don't even know what that is, for half an hour. And if I don't get given any food, I don't eat. I can't, and that was just the plan. It's a no plan, and it shouldn't work. And in the first day I showed up, 7 people gave food. And in 4 years of going to Pike Place for alms, I haven't gone hungry once. And sometimes it's been really weird. Like, people don't realize we only eat once a day. So, maybe someone does sign up to give food and they come and they give like a sandwich because they're like, well, this is what I'd have for a meal. But they don't realize like, this is all the 2,000 calories, which I'm supposed to have for the day. And often it's someone I know enough, like am familiar with enough that I could say like, oh, actually a little more would be helpful. But that's not what we do as monks. Like, what people give, they give. And if we're hungry, then, it's a chance to practice with a lighter body. And every time I've like held that sila very well and been like, well, okay, today's a hungry day, and started to walk back to my kuti, something miraculous has happened every time. Like one time I just had a very light bowl. It was going to be a hungry day. And this homeless guy came out of an alleyway. This has never happened. And he had a box of protein bars. And he's like, would you like any protein bars? And I was like, yeah, sure. Like, that's never happened. Another time I'd gotten not quite enough food. And the bus driver, I take a 5-minute bus ride in one part of my path. And the bus driver just randomly turned around. I think I'd met him once, and he just handed me this huge bag of food, like that had never happened before. I walked Tudong from LA to Wat Metta, or Oceanside near LA to Wat Metta, where Ajahn Jeff is. And someone had bought me a Greyhound bus ticket to the place where I was going to start my walk, but Greyhound dropped me off at the wrong city, basically. And the person at the bus stop was like, oh, no problem. It's just a 5-minute or a $5 bus ticket to where you need to go. But I don't use money. Like, it was a 2-day walk. So I was kind of feeling a bit down. And then literally like 5 minutes later, I hadn't really had enough to eat either. And then 5 minutes later, about 10 minutes before my cutoff from when I could stop eating, this person randomly came up and just offered me a full meal with 10 minutes left. And so just to say, like, I think about the hell realms sometimes, but much more often now, my heart rests in this place with these other realms of like, we're not alone in this path. And however bad things can seem with American politics and everything, like, to know that there's a whole other strata of goodness that I think is a canopy for us, and to trust that if you really give faith, you can name it the Dhamma or the universe if you want, but if you're practicing well, I really do think you are protected. So I find that to be a really meaningful thing to talk about.
Mm, mm.
How did
Thank
all
you.
that land, Jess?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was really touching. Thank you so much.
If
What
you
do
want,
Go
oh,
ahead.
please. No, you. Sorry.
I
Go on.
think you might have been going where I was going, actually. No, it's just it's so meaningful what you just shared, and I would love to learn more about all of this and even find teachers, like yourself. But it's just so different from everything that I'm exposed to, and I sit with a lot of different teachers and practice a lot. So I'm not sure if the document that you shared already has a lot of different resources, but if you do plan to share any, additional books, names, sits, I would love that.
No, so great, Jess. On our channel, you'll find some talks on cosmology, but what I'd steer you towards is there's a teacher called Ajahn Achalo. Who has heard of Ajahn Achalo? So he's on Insight Timer, and you can find his YouTube channel. No one talks about devas like Ajahn Achalo. He really leans into it, and it's really fun. Like, yeah, he'll just go there without any sense of embarrassment. And if you're hungry for that, he's your guy. So Ajahn Achalo, and I'll type that his how you spell his name in the chat. And the other place is if you type Abhayagiri 20th Anniversary Collection, there's a collection of Dharma talks, and there's a whole section halfway down the page on Tudong, which is this walking on faith. And those are my favorite talks pretty much on the internet, is these like talks of these monks just going off into California with no plan and no money and nothing, and just how the world answers them. So, and finally, Ajahn Punadamo, for kind of the clear depiction of cosmology, he's your guy. But in terms of sort of the more faith-oriented approaches, that's Ajahn Achalo, and the Tudong talks are the best. So.
And the other one, Tudong, Tudong.
Yeah, and we have some on our website too, clearmountainmonastery.org. I have a few, I've written a lot about our Tudong. It's where Ajahn Kovilo and I really became friends, was walking Tudong together. And Abhayagiri 20th Anniversary Collection. If you type that in, you'll get these great talks. And Ajahn Punadamo, he's the one who wrote the Buddhist Cosmos, which is in the description.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, good. And Kathy just shared Ajahn Achala's website, and yeah, I found myself so hungry for these teachings. I love them, and I love talking about devas, like less about hell realms, but I mean, in terms of thinking about, but there's a lot there too. So, Bill, are you all right? We do have more Q&A sessions coming up. Do you mind if we take a break and you can be first up on the question queue on our next Q&A session?
Of course.
Okay, let's do that. Let's 10-minute break, and we'll come back together at about 10:33. The first realm I want to talk about is, we'll start from the lowest, which is the hell realms, Niraya. And the Buddha doesn't speak about these in detail too often, but there are some places. I think the Bala Pandita Sutta is one of them. And he depicts the hell realms where people can fall if they've engaged in really negative karma. There's the Avijji hell, which he talks about as this sort of cube of fire, and people find themselves arising in it, and flame jets out from the various walls and burns them, and then a door opens in the distance and they all run for the door, and right when they're about to get there, it closes, and their skin is all flayed off, and then they're reborn again and again and again over a huge amount of time. Eventually, sometimes he says that they escape from that place and fall into, I forgot the exact name of the hell, but it's another realm of darkness, of sort of dirty water, where insects bore into the body. There's another place, I believe, this might be commentarial, but where beings, especially if they've committed adultery, I think this is commentarial, are called to from the top of a tree by their sort of paramour, and they try to climb to reach their love, and the trees are covered in thorns, and they find themselves ripped. And there's, in the commentaries, freezing hells, there's sort of realms of heat, of dirt, of piercing feelings, all these different variations on suffering, basically. And it's a brutal image. And I think a few reflections are relevant. First is that in Buddhism, no realm is forever. Every realm can fade. And eventually, even those beings who have been brought to the lowest realms, and in the Buddhist thought, because samsara is without discernible beginning, we've all been in the hell realms. We've all experienced every single realm. We've all the Buddhist says it is impossible that you find a being who has not been your mother, your brother, your sister, your mother. And this is one of the sort of means that the Tibetan tradition uses to initiate compassion, is you remember every being you encounter has been your mother. And the compassion that can lead to is profound. And it also can lead to a sense of disenchantment with this whole round. We've landed in a good place now. The human realm is extremely fortunate rebirth, but if we don't apply ourselves to practice, we don't know where we land next. And the hells are a possibility, unless you've become a stream enter. And if you've achieved the first level awakening, which is stream entry, the idea is that you can't fall to those lower realms, the niraya. The other thing I'd like to mention is the hell realms seem to be, they're depicted very almost psychedelically. It's like they're clear depictions of these psychological states, the state of heat of fire, of that kind of flavor of suffering, or the depiction of the freezing realms of, really a sense of cold, and other ones of claustrophobic. Just these realms of, or feelings of kind of different flavors of despair. And I find it relevant. Many of you will know the 12 links of dependent origination, and the last link, suffering. The 12 links are how ignorance leads to craving, to birth, and then eventually to death and suffering. And the kind of crescendo of suffering, it's a bit of a riff where the Buddha says, one, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. And Longpa Punadhammo has a funny quote where he says, people say about you, criticize us and say, you Buddhists, all you talk about is suffering. But that's not true. We also talk about sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. And I think, the idea that dukkha can mean everything from the slightest stress, the slightest bit of knot in a deep state of samadhi, of doing, but it can also refer to the depths of suffering. And to note how one of the most significant things I find about practice is after a few years, you find that word despair no longer applies to your experience. Like, really notice that. How you can recall maybe years ago when you really believe that you are this body, this personality, when you haven't cultivated this sense of just a slight separation from experience. Ajahn Sucitto talks about mindfulness as hovering 1 inch off the ground. And similarly, these depictions in paintings, in these 12 links in the Tibetan depiction, iconography, there's always a monk somewhere in those, in the sky, kind of floating above it all. And just the sense that after a few years, that sense of real despair, of really believing in the whole story, it's not there anymore. Like, things still are difficult. We still suffer. Things still suck sometimes. But despair is no longer a flavor. And for me, that's a real sign that someone's mind is no longer sinking to the hell realm. And to really note that, because we can miss it. Like, when people look for the light nimitta, the sort of sign of light in meditation, it's a very common experience when you follow the breath or any meditation object to see light begin to arise. And people miss it because they're looking for a ball of light. But what it often is, the light nimitta, the sign of light, nimitta means kind of sign. It's more the whole visual field becomes brighter. And even so, in our practice, often we're looking for one thing to say, oh, look, I'm getting better. What we've missed is our whole life has just brightened a little bit. And maybe we don't have despair. And I really think noting that and making much of it and taking heart in it is important. The depictions of, I spent some time, the depictions of the hell realms in many places they talk about beings crammed into a space like mustard seeds in a jar. And the sense of kind of claustrophobia, of being packed in, but also of utter separation with those near us. And just to notice that feeling, like when we are in a hell realm, and it can mean a lot when we wake up, and notice this kind of burning sensation. When we wake up on the wrong side of the bed, when we're looking for something to be angry about. And there's a lot of strength, and this is Chittanusati, Chittanupasana, the third foundation of mindfulness, knowing the mind. When you're like, oh, the mind is in a hell realm right now, and just being really on your guard and not projecting that, because if you're in that realm, you're going to find something wrong with how your spouse is acting, or your boss, and just have patience and know that like that hell realm, especially as you practice, it won't last that long. Like you will buoy up. I've heard some very interesting theories that Dante's Inferno is almost a perfect depiction of the hell realms that Buddhism had, and that Dante actually just got a hold of a depiction of the Petavatu, the Buddhist cosmology, and that's actually what the Inferno is based on. They're very similar. And I'll say that I don't spend that much time thinking about the hell realms. I'm not sure how much use there is in it, except to really take seriously what a precious birth we have and to not break our sila, to keep our virtue. And when the Buddha talks about sila, virtue, he talks about one delights in virtue that is untorn, unspotted, unsplattered, and unblemished. And as we practice to note that there is a protective quality in virtue, the Buddha said some of the characteristics of virtue is one approaches any assembly with confidence, and one dies unconfused. And that sense of protection, and noticing when you stray from that, when you wound your virtue just a little bit, when you do something you shouldn't, it's like a rusty nail ripping through cloth, and the tornness of it, and the sense of vulnerability, like really, it's like suddenly you've bought into this conditioned realm by breaking for the sake of sense experience, or the five aggregates. You've broken somehow away from that line of Dhamma. And for me, I can sense I'm vulnerable in that moment. In Buddhism, it's talked about as an okasa for Mara to come, an opening. And there's actually a story in the suttas of a novice who's possessed by a yaka. And it's because he was breaking his sila, and his sort of it gave an opening for a force to come in and kind of wound him. But to know that if you are keeping good sila, if you're taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, you're safe. The Buddha said there's 5 kinds of loss. There's relatives, wealth, and health. Then there's right view and virtue. He said the first 3 are trifling. You will lose your health, you will lose your relatives, you will lose your wealth. But the last 2 are what you should care about the most. And the sense that no one can take your view, right view, in line with the Buddha's teachings. No one can take your virtue. That, you read stories of the Gulag Archipelago, where Alexander Solzhenitsyn is talking about existing in these concentration camps, and just these brilliant beings who he talks about, who would not lie for anything. Even starving, they wouldn't break their sila. And just the radiance in them, it's so inspiring. And someone asked one of the Dalai Lama's disciples, who was jailed by the Chinese for 20 years, if he ever was afraid. And he said, I got afraid that I might lose loving kindness for my captors. But he didn't. And that sense that something in this path in us becomes invulnerable. And even in the darkest places, we can have a refuge in ourselves. But where I want to go next is the ghost realm. And this is more relevant, I think. Because, first of all, I think as we practice, less and less of us spend our time in the hell realm. Like, that deep level of despair and suffering is rare. for many of us. But the ghost realm, the petas, as they're called, often many of you might know their depictions in many Buddhist circles are the hungry ghosts, and they're depicted as these beings with these teeny pinhole mouths and these big bellies that are always hungry, starving, but never able to take in enough sustenance, this sense of craving. But in folklore, often the ghosts are depicted as just kind of these beings that aren't able to let go, and obsession is a classic feature. So there's one great story I love of these different monastics walking Tudong, and they all stop. It's in Thailand. I think it's just a random story, but I really like it. They stop and they sleep in this abandoned hut, and they're all different heights. So initially all their heads are lined up, but their feet are all sticking out at different angles. And the house is haunted, and a ghost doesn't like how all their feet are differently aligned. So it goes along their sort of base and pushes all their feet into alignment. But then all their heads are out of line. So the ghost kind of walks around and then pushes all their heads into alignment, but then their feet are out of line. And so the ghost goes around and pushes their feet into alignment, and on and on. And this kind of mind state of rattling around this old house, this old closet that we know too well. I think the depressed mind state is the hungry ghost mind state. And we all know this one very well. I think this is a much more common place for us to be, of, going over the same self-deprecating thought or the same narrative again and again, and the emptiness of it. Or finding ourselves kind of comfortable with an old claustrophobic dry narrative, kind of rattling around in this old house because we know it and it's familiar. There's a beautiful poem I know that says, the great strength it takes to walk away from a stone you've been pushing your whole life. And Ajahn Jeff says, the last thing you can take from people is their suffering. And many people have the experience of, if you have a good meditation, at least for me, if I have a really good meditation, I'll get out of it and think, oh no, tomorrow's going to be really bad. Because, when you have a good sit, often it's like you find yourself on the top of a mountaintop and the air is thin. And for a moment you can stand there. But soon enough, you'll start to flail, and your mind will want to find anything to orient on. And the place where minds orient is suffering. And you'll find that the defilements hit very hard the next day often. And for me, that's just a sign of how we orient ourselves by our suffering. And so with depression or these craving obsessions, often it's just a sense of comfort in orienting ourselves. We know this structure of self-criticism or obsession, the thing we just think about. It's the hungry ghost mind state. And just noting that, being like, oh, this is my hungry ghost mind state again. And there's a few things to draw out there. One is that the hungry ghosts, the Buddha spoke about spreading merit, and that one should do this whenever one does good. The Buddha said you should dedicate it to your relatives who have passed. And a Brahmin asks, can all my relatives who have passed away receive this merit which I'm dedicating to them? And the Buddha said no, like if they're in the hell realms or these lower realms or much higher realms, often they can't receive it. But if they're in the ghost realm, they can. It's nearby. And the Brahmin asks, what if I have no relatives in the ghost realm? And the Buddha says it is impossible. You've been reborn so many times. There's always a being who has been a relative of yours in the ghost realm nearby. And when we talk about dedicating merit, it can sound like this esoteric economy, like, okay, it sounds so esoteric and kind of strange and superstitious. But what it means is you do a good act and then you recollect and offer and invite someone in your life, or just an open invitation to rejoice in the goodness you did. Just as if, someone, a relative of yours, tells you, oh, I was going to, I brought food to the food bank today, and I did it because I was thinking of you, and I thought of you the whole time, and I dedicated it to you, and I did it in your name. Like, it lifts your heart up, and it almost invites you to identify with that act of goodness and to be nourished by it. That's all dedication of merit is. You're just inviting others to rejoice in a good act. And the Buddha said that this is, if a being is nearby in the ghost realm, they're close. You'll remember the simile where the human realm is the tree covered in foliage and the ghost realm is the barren tree. And each culture, pretty much every culture apart from secular American culture, does this. Everyone has this practice of ancestor worship or recollection, Dia de los Muertos, where people actually bring offerings of food to the graves of the dead. Ancestor worship in Chinese culture. There's holidays in Thailand based completely around recollecting the dead and doing good for them. And we've forgotten our dead. We've forgotten our dead in the West. And the teachers who have visited the West, who say they have psychic powers, say that the streets are full of these hungry ghosts because no one dedicates merit to them. And I mean, like any kind of secular Westerner, I was very skeptical initially when I fell into that category of this whole thing. And I stayed at the monastery of a monk named Ajahn Nisabho. You can look up our interview with him. He speaks about this. And a woman came up and after the meal, and she said, my mom passed away in Sri Lanka a few weeks ago, and I keep having these dreams of her, and she's shivering and cold, and she asks for clothing and for food. And Ajahn Kalyana says, oh, she's in the Peta realm. You need to do good, to give offerings to the Sangha, and then dedicate the merit to her. And afterwards, I went up to him and I said, I've heard about this in the suttas, but I've never seen it in reality. And he said, oh, this happens all the time. And as a monk, a lot of people come and they've had experiences like this, like dreaming of the dead. And the Buddha said, this is what you do. You do good and you dedicate it to them. And that's how the ghosts can be nourished. So I think it's worth taking into account just for those who pass, who are close to us. After people pass, I often recommend keeping a candle burning on a little shrine to them for 7 days and spread loving kindness to them for 7 days, just to see them on their way, to help them move on if they need it. Inviting them, saying, don't worry about holding on, like things are okay, let go. And I dedicate the merit of my life to you. And every morning and evening, I'll dedicate the merit of my life to all beings, to my parents, to those who I think need it. And at the very least, it changes your relationship to their memory. It changes it from this thing of loss and sadness to, whenever I think of my dad or my mom or someone who's passed, my parents are still alive, but it's a moment to think about goodness and doing goodness in their memory. Like, what a beautiful way to transmute that memory. And maybe it has real benefit for them, And it's interesting because you can't give directly to the ghosts. And I think this is another profound psychological lesson hidden in the depiction of the hungry ghosts. Is there's a commentarial story of a husband and wife, and the husband is very generous, and the wife is very stingy. And when the husband passes away, he's reborn as a Bhumadeva, a tree angel, basically, a tree spirit, which is a pretty good rebirth in a very beautiful tree. And his wife, who's stingy, is reborn as a hungry ghost, a preta. And every night she'll come and ask him, she's shivering and cold and asks for clothing. And he tries to give her clothing. He tries to give her food, but the moment she touches it, it disappears, or it turns into I think the clothing she tries to put on turns into burning metal. And a bhikkhu eventually comes, a monk, and sits under the tree. And the husband, the deva, comes to the monk in his meditation and asks, how do I help my wife? And the monk says, you need to do good and then dedicate the merit to her. And so the tree deva, I think he gives an offering to the monk somehow. I'm not sure how that happens in the spirit realm, and then he dedicates the goodness to his wife, and suddenly she has food and clothing. And the lesson there for me is, with family members or loved ones who are in the throes of addiction, and we have many in our community who have children struggling with addiction or alcoholism, or being under the spell of fentanyl, etc. It's a real dilemma and a lot of suffering, and I have to have humility when I speak about this. I have never had someone in my life have this amount of addiction, but often if people try to give directly to that person, it ends up enabling them. Like, the person is so caught in craving that often giving money or assistance gets kind of co-opted into the craving, and it doesn't work. Basically, it's like the husband trying to give clothing to his wife and it turning into burning. If you give money to someone who's really in the throes of addiction, they may use it for their addiction. And what I take as such a profound lesson there is, often a way that you can interact with someone under that level of craving in the hungry ghost realm is doing good and then inviting them into that goodness, or letting them know you're dedicating it to them. So kind of an oblique movement towards goodness. Maybe it is as simple as just telling that loved one, every day I'm meditating and I'm really thinking of you. Or maybe it's more. Maybe it's inviting them along to some good thing you do, like getting them to come along to the soup kitchen with you. But the point is, it's kind of a lateral movement of goodness that you're inviting them along with. And I think there's something to be said for, like, sometimes that's how you can interact with a hungry ghost or someone in that mind state. I think that's quite beautiful. But more than anything, I think it's just a really relevant mind state to have an image for. Like, just knowing, oh, this is the craving, hungry ghost mind state where I'm shivering. And in that state, knowing, that you should dedicate love, imagine spreading brightness, imagine helping another person. And apart from just knowing what that mind state looks like in Buddhist cosmology, knowing that there is a way of interacting with it that brightens it and can elevate it. And then also taking seriously this invitation to remember our dead. And even if you don't believe in that, even if, it doesn't even if they can't receive the goodness, there's something very powerful about not forgetting those who have passed. It's like we've been listening to treble our whole lives, and suddenly you hear a bass note. And I think that's something our culture is very much missing. Ajahn Chah said, if you don't understand death, life is very confusing. And so taking that invitation from the Buddha to not forget those who have passed. So I think that's enough on those two states. And we have scheduled another talk, but just trying to feel the rhythm of this out, and just feels nicer to have a more intimate kind of morning with everyone. So maybe we could just open up for some Q&A, and I'll speak after another few minutes a little more about asuras and animals, and that's really fun. But we can finish up with a Q&A after that, but let's just open up some room quickly or for a bit. And it can be on cosmology or on the meditation we just did, or just on anything that's on people's minds. And Bill, I know we had said that could be first on the queue. Do you, was it Bill, I think?
Couple things. One, this really rings true, this discussion and what I'm hearing today. And it's interesting because it's part of it seems to be ringing true as part of a deep story in me that, has been there. I've been aware of it in some back corner. I toyed with it. But it's really interesting how just the realms. I haven't ever turned myself off to those, but I've never sat in on a discussion. So I appreciate this. And this, my original question, kind of was similar to Jess's question. That I've heard a lot from teachers. Different teachers saying, you don't have to believe in this. It's true, but you don't have to believe in this, right? And I get confused in that, because if it's something to be awakened, you don't have to believe in rebirth, and you don't have to, so how does that, if it's a tenet of Buddhism, right? And I have to write these things down or I go down some rabbit hole. But how does one believe in the teachings of Buddha and yet not accept the teachings? That's just one of those questions that I have, because it's permanently there with almost every teacher I've heard. So, well, not permanently, nothing's permanent.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. The exact question of like if one needs to believe in rebirth to attain awakening, I've actually always been a bit unsure about that. I think likely not, but I'm not certain. And for me, this was a lot of the Buddha's wisdom in, there's the Kalama Sutta, where the Kalamas come to him very doubtful about, we have all these teachers teaching us different things. Some are teaching us about rebirth and others aren't. People who say that the Buddha was just taking on the beliefs of his time don't realize it was a cornucopia of belief in India at that time. It was a real, cosmopolitan in the spiritual sense scene. And there was a lot of beliefs, and some of them were nihilistic. And so the Kalamas have been taught all these different things and ask the Buddha, and he says, it is right that you are doubting. This is a doubtful matter. And then he says, what do you think, Kalamas, if you act out of greed, hatred, and delusion, does it lead to your own suffering and the suffering of others? And they say, yes. If you don't act of those things, does it not lead to those, does it lead to happiness and well-being? Yes. Is it praised by the wise? Yes. And then he tells them to cultivate loving kindness. And then he says, look, it's like a double bet is what he calls it. If there is no rebirth and you act well, then you still live a good life and you're praised by the wise, so you win. If there is rebirth and you act well, then you're reborn in a heavenly state, so you also win. So it's a good bet either way. But what's important there is he also kind of meets them where they're at. He doesn't say, no, you need to accept this right now. He recognizes that right now what they know is cultivating the wholesome, and that's the key of the path. That's enough for a lot of us to work with for a long time. And I think that's really a beautiful part of Buddhism. It's a gentle on-ramp, and you can go a long way just with that much belief. And I think that's why every teacher will usually put that caveat in, because people who aren't kind of open to this, then that's okay. You can still practice well. But I think people also underestimate the power of the belief. Like I grew up as a secular materialist, like, um, and I can say that if you start to really believe that this life echoes on and that each moral action remains and that you've been circling around rebirth after rebirth after rebirth for eons, the scene changes substantially and each moral act is given immense weight in a new way. And renunciation makes more sense. Like it's very helpful in terms of moving on the path and giving up the sort of lures, baits of the world to believe that you've had everything that there is on the menu many times already. Like you want to walk out of the restaurant after a while, and yeah. So just to say, I also intuited a deeper story at work when I like something I kind of was interested in and felt a resonance with. I find it very helpful to read the concrete research on past life memories of children. I really recommend people look into that book Before by not Tucker Carlson, Jim Tucker. I'd be interested in that book. Jim B. Tucker and the University of Virginia, because it really helps to see the concrete. There's a lot of evidence for it. But also that's why we don't, I think it's really meaningful that you don't have to buy into it right off the bat, and maybe not even by the very end. I know people I believe who've had experiences of stream entry who I don't think they had a belief in rebirth when they had that glimpse of awakening. So yeah, but I had a similar hunger for as you did, Bill, and when I heard teachers talk about this and the devas and the angels, something in my heart sang and leapt up. Like less so when I'm talking about the asuras, like it's fun and the ghost realms, but yeah, it's like I said, like it feels like you're listening to treble on music your whole life and suddenly you begin to hear the bass. And for me, like the whole Buddhist world is rich and fascinating and variegated and sparkly, and there's enough room for a whole human spirit in it. Um, and it's difficult with Western secular Buddhism where you're only given some of that. And I feel like there's parts of the heart which can use more of the color to really blossom. Um, how does that land, Bill? Any follow-ups or thoughts?
No, that was great. Uh, I always just kind of come back to the question that I'm just beginning and learning: is there anything, just such a thing as a stub toe, or is everything karma? So but yes, you answered my question. It was great, and it is about enlightenment. It's one of those things where it's also allowing us to like be at our own space and our own
Yeah.
pace, and so few other Christian religions, whatever, it's jump in the deep end, you got to buy it all, and there isn't a lot of room for error, or for um, thinking about it and maybe saying, nah, that part doesn't really work for me.
Yeah, and it's
Like,
no, thank you, Bill. And it's interesting. We translate sada, which is the Buddhist word for confidence or faith. Often we'll kind of tone it down and say it's confidence because faith is so loaded. And it's true, it is. Like you can meet that word at that level. But also as you begin to practice, like a sense of love and joy and real uplift at the Buddha. And what amazing teachings and what a path, like at some point, the word confidence no longer does justice to the heart's experience of homecoming, of love, and that's where the word faith, I think it regains its relevance for us. And so I understand why we often speak to that lowest common denominator of confidence, the practical teachings, and that's great. But I think we lose something if we never speak unabashedly to these other aspects of the tradition and what the heart can intuit, whether that just be like the joy of love of these teachings and of the Buddha, or of angels and hells and ghosts and all this. It's a wild world out there, and it's funny. Like people come away from like Christianity thinking they're getting a total, sterile version of Buddhism. And little do they know, like we have a way wilder cosmology. So, Joanna, please.
I have a question. During this meditation process of letting go of our identity, I was thinking, how that correspond to our subtle bodies? Because I suppose when we leave this physical body, we don't right away lose our identity. Like I've listened to some of the NDEs, and some people say they still see themselves. And at what point do we actually have an understanding of our identity? Like at what level?
That's a great question, Joanna. The part of letting go is, it's interesting, like a paradox in the practice is one practice which has been not brought to the West very much is that of Asubha, looking at the body as unattractive. And that's really prominent in Thailand and ancient Buddhist cultures. But what's very interesting is when you do that, what you find is the chitta, the subtle body, actually becomes more and more vibrant and apparent, because your mind is no longer infusing this form of calcium and pus and water and flesh with that sense of self. And as it releases, you often find the chitta, the heart, rises and expands and becomes much more bright. And that is my experience, and many people's, with that death meditation, is the letting go. It's like one of the great insights in Buddhism is when you let go of your gripping, your hand sort of fills with sunlight, and it's more subtle, but it's bright. And after death, the Buddha didn't say much about the interim state between lives. And so a lot of what we can glean, he said a little bit, but a lot of what we can glean about what that experience might be like is from the folklore. And one interesting practice they have in Thailand is if someone dies in a sudden accident, usually on death, they'll burn the body quite quickly. But if someone dies in like a car wreck, they'll actually not burn the body for quite a while. And that's so that the ghost, it doesn't always realize it's dead. Like it's like the sixth sense. It really thinks it doesn't realize quite what's happened. So they leave the corpse so that the ghost can see its dead body and realize that it's dead and let go, which I find fascinating. It's a really interesting little thing they do. And so part of, I think, what the ghost realm is about, why it has to do with obsession and craving, is because often the ghosts they're still bound to some sense of identity and confusion and an unwholesome sense of not having let go. And a lot of what you're doing is inviting them to let go into the next phase, to not kind of still be obsessed or bound. And exactly what that experience is like, who knows? I've heard some really fascinating depictions based on, it seems to be somewhat influenced by our culture. For example, like what often will happen is people will come to, like in China, I've heard many people for their near-death experience will come to kind of a judge, but it's very bureaucratic. Like they'll go into this whole system with paperwork and like decide where they're going to go next, which is hilarious. And I don't know what it's like for Westerners, but the idea is then you do find another rebirth. And it's very hard for us to exist without an identity. The Tibetans speak a lot about the bardo states between, and it's, one thing that is very common is you see these glimmering lights and you can't resist getting sucked in. And I think that's a relevant reflection for us in the sense of like when you're in between places in life, like between a relationship or a job, it takes such poise to like not jump into the next thing, but to like hold still in that space of non-sure and like let something emerge. And like I think we can learn a lot from understanding how to be in the bardos of our own lives based on that, and letting a new identity kind of come up wholesomely out of the Dharma, So does that make some sense, Joanna? I mean,
Yes,
okay.
yes, thank you.
I love reading NDE experiences too. They're really fun. I find they give some faith. Patricia.
Your wisdom. Wow, I'm deeply moved. I just want to comment on teachers. I have some very, very dear teachers. I live close to 2 monasteries that I frequent, and excellent teachers. And I've had 5 deaths in my family since January 18th, the first one being my father. And I do believe that with my practice deepening, and I have a pretty strong practice, that my sensitivity has grown. And I had an experience of my father visiting, and he was very hungry, very needy, very unsettled. And I took this to both teachers, Aya and Longpor. And my reflection has taken me to really sort of venturing towards other teachers that are willing to talk about this, because some of our teachers, they're right. I don't have the experience. They say it's not where I need to put my energy, but there was definitely something more that I quested after and did some more research and spoke to some other teachers. So I'm really appreciative of you and Ajahn Kovilo bringing this to the fore. And I'm very familiar with Longpo Punadamo and the writing. But to me, it's a sense of coming together as a Sangha and, being open enough and brave enough to really consider. We don't have to say yes 100%. I believe this, but boy, oh boy, when you do deepen your practice, you actually open to these things in a different way. And the saddha, that total faith that comes with experience on the path, it's reassuring, in terms of going forward. But I'm very appreciative of the offerings and also the comments by each of us here today too. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And do you want to say the name? Well, actually, at the end, we'll dedicate merit to your father and the others who have passed. How about that? Thank you for saying all that. And yeah, I mean, I think we do a disservice to our Buddhist community as it's growing by not speaking to these, because it matters. Like, I'd really recommend looking look at our interview with Ajahn Kalyano on our channel. There's very few monks there's some monks who speak about this more openly and who I think have very direct experience with those who have passed and being able to encounter those chittas. I would say to listen to his interview, and we ask him about this. And yeah, I think it makes a difference. I lived with a teacher named Ajahn Tong, and he's sort of a hidden Kruba Ajahn. No one knows about him, but an amazing being. He's the last novice that Ajahn Chah ordained. And I saw him, he loved to bless things, and people would bring like water for him to bless, and he'd bless it, and all of the hair on his arm would just stand straight up. And he one day there was a nurse that came to the monastery named Yomnit, and he said, "Yomnit, did you have a blind black cat that just died?" And Yomnit said, "No, but yesterday I was driving and I passed this carcass of this black cat on the side of the road, and its eyes were all crusted over." And Ajahn Tong said, "Yeah, I just had a nimitta of it. It felt your metta as you passed it, and it's asking for you to make merit and dedicate it to it." And like, it's such a strange foreign thing to hear as a Westerner, but I mean, he had no way of knowing she passed a blind black cat. And I mean, I trusted this teacher I would trust him with my life. I mean, the idea that he was lying is just insane to me. He was one of the most pure beings I've ever met. And now whenever I see a dead animal on the side of the road, I usually try to move it a little bit and bury it, or I can't dig actually, so I usually like cover it over with some bushes and chant Om Mani Padme Om and dedicate merit. And if we do that for even the little beings in our life, what about those who have passed away, who are close to us? And some of them, especially if there's no belief in an afterlife, I think it can be very confusing to be released from the body and be like, whoa, what is this? And I think it can mean a lot if they have a reference point of someone who loves them, able to say, it's okay, like, let go. And there's an amazing sutta in Majjhima Nikaya 5 or 6, Akankeya, where the Buddha says, if one should wish, when my relatives pass, may they remember me with faith and go to a brighter rebirth, basically. Let one fulfill the precepts, practice well, not neglect meditation, etc. And for me, that sutta is the Buddha saying that even if someone in our life is very closed off to our practice, maybe they're very reactive against our Buddhist practice, maybe they're Christian and don't like how, what we're doing, maybe they're just not interested, maybe they're far away and we're out of contact. But for me, that sutta is the Buddha saying that even if in life they are distant, when someone dies, often there's a clarity of vision that actually your practice can really be the orienting piece for them in that moment, and it's not for nothing. So Anumodana, Patricia, for honoring the teachings that way and following them a bit, and I'm glad that you found some sustenance in that. I certainly have. So, and once again, for those on this call who kind of are a bit more hesitant about these things, totally all right. But heck, if we can't talk about it as monks, then who can? So it's okay. I did say I'd talk about the asuras, so I'll just do that briefly. I really, the Q&A sessions, they just tend to bring out a sanctity, which is very meaningful to me, so I'd like to lean into that. I think the asuras are worth mentioning, though, and they're not in that depiction that I put onto the sheet, but they're equivalent to the Titans in Olympic mythology. And I think they're also similar to the Valhalla realm in Norse mythology, although the Norse thought that it was heaven, but it's like the asuras are always fighting, and they're always trying to kind of fight the devas. And this is in the suttas, actually. And what's so interesting is the asuras, they're about as strong as the devas and as long-lived. But where the devas live on the top of Mount Sinnaru, which is this cosmological Mount Olympus, the asuras are like a mirror image. Like in Buddhist cosmology, and this is all commentarial, the Buddha didn't say this part, but it's fascinating. Mount Sinnaru extends up where the devas live, and then it extends down under the water in a mirror image, and the asuras live on the bottom of the mountain, and they think they're in heaven. They think they're in heaven, but every now and again, this tree in this sort of sacred grove blossoms, and they see that it's not the tree they thought it was. It's not the heavenly tree of the Nanda Grove. And they realize suddenly that they're not in heaven, and so the commentaries say they swarm up the mountain like ants and sort of begin to have battle with the devas. And what I find very meaningful there is the asuras are known for anger, violence, and power. And self-righteous anger feels right. It feels like heaven, in a sense, like not refined, but it feels righteous. And we can really think like, there's a great teacher named Ajahn Mudito who we interviewed who said, greed will pretend it's your friend, anger will pretend it's necessary, and delusion will pretend it doesn't exist. And I love that. And the idea that anger pretends it's necessary, like self-righteous anger has a deep attraction to it. And that for me is the asura mind state of thinking, this is right, I am right, I'm going to act from this. And only after the fruit of that tree blossoms, only after the fruit of anger comes to bear and fruition, and you see the damage it's done and the residue, do you realize that you were actually in hell the whole time. And that's for me that it's one of those brilliant psychological truths that's like hidden in there is the asuras think they're in heaven. And be it us as in our political, convictions or otherwise, our self-righteous anger can be quite a drug. And it's interesting, there was a BBC documentary interviewing all these religious leaders, and it was fascinating because the Dalai Lama was the only one who said there's never a place for anger. And that's a Buddhist principle, is there is a place for acting to change things. There is a place for flavors of truth that you find in anger. Like often anger arises with a sense of like, this is wrong and it needs to change. But all those, if you let the anger, the rage die down, what you'll find is often those convictions and that clarity remains. But the anger is not necessary. And there's a rule in the Vinaya where as monastics, we can't admonish another monk unless we meet several conditions. We have to speak honestly, we have to speak at the right time, we have to ask and receive permission, and we have to speak from a place of loving kindness. And that is a brilliant firewall for a relationship, because you find that one about speaking from a place of loving kindness, like we have one monk who had to wait a whole year until he could fulfill that requirement. But usually it only takes, an hour, maybe 15 minutes until you really can, come to a place of like some spaciousness, and just the conversation from that place is a whole different conversation. And action taken out of love is always more powerful. So a huge portion of the practice is having the patience to notice when we're in an asura realm and waiting until we can kind of be in a deva realm and then speaking and acting from there. For me, that's the difference between a vigil and a protest, is a vigil is different. And I think it can be equally as powerful, if not more. So there's more to say, and there's other things we can speak to. But more than anything, I just wanted to speak to that asura realm. And briefly to the animal realm, which just to say one of the conditions that people speak about with initiating the animal realm is that creating that karma is scheming for food. And it's such a specific cause, but it's so relevant. And I just think a useful thing where if you find yourself kind of proliferating around pizza or whatever, just being like, okay, this is my little animal mind state. And, is that really the part of your heart you want to cultivate? And often I find that if you're kind of circling around some fantasy of whatever you're going to eat after this meditation retreat or the next day, often the way out of it's just to label it as suffering. Just be like, oh, suffering, this is suffering. And that's enough. But I also find it useful to recollect that, that is an animal mind state. And that sort of gluttonous urge, like if you can slow down and, if you find yourself eating from that place or doing anything, drinking, smoking, whatever, just slowing that animal momentum enough that you can bring some mindfulness and like slow down your bites, chew, put the spoon down between bites, whatever, or whatever equivalent you want to bring for whatever the addiction is, that kind of slows down the animal momentum and makes you human again. And that's quite useful to do. So those are the lower realms, people. And to finish on a deva note, since people did like the stories of devas in Tudong, one of my favorite stories was, actually this is ironically about food, was there's a bunch of monks like 30 years ago from Wat Pah Nanachat, the International Forest Monastery, and they were on Tudong in rural Thailand, sort of out in the middle of nowhere, and they'd been walking for days, just getting offered some sticky rice. They're Westerners who have been gone from the West for, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and, some kind of were probably not being terribly restrained and said, God, wouldn't it be great if we just had like pizza just once, after this many years away from it? And They were like literally in sort of this rural part of Thailand 40, 30 years ago where there's nothing. Um, and the next morning, this person drives up and their car is filled with boxes of pizza that they've picked up from like some like the one pizza store in Ubon or something like that. And somehow they just happened to be passing by. And so they offered all the monks pizza. And that story has remained in our Sangha for like 30 years because it was so exceptional. And the other story was there was two monks on Tudong. I think I met one of them in Australia, and one of their socks, they got caught in a storm, and the socks of one of the monks got completely soaked. And that's not a small thing if you're walking 20 miles a day and don't have any way of drying socks. And the next morning, they walked into the next city, and there's a woman waiting for them at the threshold of the city with a pair of dry socks. And she said, yeah, actually, it was kind of weird. Some being came to me in my dream last night and said that I should stand here with socks, and that there were two monks and they needed socks, or one of them did. And so here I am. And then they got socks. So take it or leave it, but I love those stories personally. Anyways, we have time for about 5 more minutes of questions, and then we can kind of wrap up the morning. And if people are feeling a bit off-put by the kind of confidence with which I'm talking about these cosmological realms, please feel free to raise your hand and comment. It's all okay. And just know that, we really make room in this teaching for people at every level of belief and, feeling around this issue. But I find it really fun to talk about because I love it. And I think the psychological truths in it are pretty profound as well. So, yeah, Carl.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been very interesting for me. I started doing hospice work about 6 months ago, and it's been very interesting. And about a little 2.5 weeks ago, a friend of mine ended up in hospice that I work in, so it put a different flavor to it. And I knew the family was friends. But anyway, I wonder if you might comment on being a hospice volunteer. It's been very good for me just in terms of general practice on kindness or friendliness. But I just wondered if you might comment about that kind of practice.
Thank you for doing that work, Carl. I think I'm not very qualified to speak to it. I don't have experience sitting with dying. You probably are familiar with the work of Stephen Levine or Levine. Yeah, I mean, just amazing hospice work. Or there's quite a few Buddhist lay teachers who have such deep wisdom on those issues. The one thing I might say, apart from some of that traditional kind of advice you'll get from them around not trying to help necessarily, but just kind of being present and understanding whatever's kind of going on there is much deeper than most of us have the direct ability to influence. Leaning into physical touch if the person's open. I've heard that as a beautiful idea. When people speak to me about, working with a loved one who's dying or are encountering death themselves or on the edge of cancer, what I often feel like I can give, apart from sort of traditional thoughts, around birth being normal, death being normal, like, taking away some of the kind of sense that this is completely wrong, like in a Buddhist framework. I think there's a real beauty to that. Like, yeah, this is this is it. But what I feel is often unique that we can bring, or that I can bring, is, if someone is open to those ideas of rebirth, or of angels, and we're willing to speak about it a little bit, that can be something they're not hearing anywhere else. And sometimes, you have to be sensitive to this as a hospice volunteer, obviously, and navigate your own beliefs. But, often maybe there is room for that conversation, and maybe they're even interested in talking about that with someone, even if it's their own belief, that can have a lot of power for someone. And, also to say that if you kind of hold this truth, or this idea that when their body goes, they're not totally gone right away. Often their chitta is hanging around for a while. I think you can use that knowledge, and maybe what it means is, you sit in the room with the body for a while after it's passed and spread loving kindness to it. Or maybe if you develop a relationship with someone in hospice, maybe you get a picture of them, and for a few weeks after they passed, you light a candle every evening and spread loving kindness, and you tell the family that you're doing that. Just like maybe there's some room for touching or speaking to or honoring this less spoken to element of what death might mean if we're not just the body. And even if it's not a belief you hold, maybe it can honor someone else's belief a little bit by at least being open to talking about that with someone. So that's just a possibility. But I do find the simplest thing I do tell people when others are dying in their life is just light a candle, like make a little shrine for them at home with pictures of them, and light a candle for a week, and spreading love to, spreading care to them. And at the very least, that's just such a beautiful thing for them to do for themselves. So, yeah, how did that land, Carl? I don't totally. You'll have much more experience with this than I do.
No, I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Sadhu, all of you, may you spend the rest of the day in a heaven realm, not in the hell realms. Hopefully this is enough of that for all of you. And feel free to, we have clearmountainmonastery.org is our website. Every Wednesday evening we have a great Zoom session. We have a Majjhima Nikaya study session every Sunday, daily meditations, and Saturday mornings. And if any of you come near Seattle, please reach out to us, and we'll try to find you a place to stay, and you can visit us. So take care, everyone. Good. Thank you, Rob. People can unmute and say goodbye if they want.